All right, so get some things out of the way before we save some time to go through content. On the module 12 quiz, there was module 9 quiz, question 12. I think for a 95% of you, it was scored correctly. I caught it after about 5% of people had taken it, and for most people, it wouldn't have impacted them. But when I set the correct answer, I think I scrolled on accident before hitting save, so it scrolled it to the very bottom option. So it was being incorrectly scored. Once again, for most of you, it didn't impact your grade once I regraded it. But after I thought about it, out of fairness, I'm just going to give everybody credit for it, just in case. But now when you go to review the exam, it has kind of so you can see what the correct answer should have been. And then on practice exam A, I re-uploaded the files. I think it was question 24. There was a typo that made 2 of the answers technically correct. So I've updated that so that there's only 1 correct answer. The concept itself doesn't matter. There's 2 correct. You should have been able to identify that there was 2 correct. But I've updated that just so that it kind of looks more reflective of like a multiple choice exam where there's only 1 correct answer. So some other things just to mention about logistics. The exam's going to look very similar to the first one, right? When you show up, it's going to be 25 questions. So that's where I've gotten some questions like practice exam A. I'd say it looks a little bit more reflective of the format of the exam. In terms of content, A and B practice exams, same type of content that you should be able to answer any question on those. You could see something pop up similar on the actual exam. It's just I was probably a little bit more lazy in writing practice exam B in terms of like the language I was using. I really made sure that formatting and kind of the wording is going to look similar from practice exam A to the actual exam. Okay? So when you show up Thursday to take that exam, you need to have something to write with. You need to have a non-graphing calculator. That's all you should have, right? If you want extra paper, you can write things on the exam itself, but I'll also have blank paper, kind of like I did for the first one. The equation sheet that's up here, I'm going to have this in the exam, right? So you'll have these equations in front of you. I mean, there's nothing crazy. I probably could expect you to kind of have these memorized, but you will have this equation sheet that you see on Canvas in the actual exam itself. Other than that, I think that should, when you turn it in, you'll need to pull open your phone, show your Crimson card. Your phone shouldn't be out at any point during the exam, right? Only thing you should have is something to write with and a non-graphing calculator, okay? Make sure I mention, in terms of resources kind of leading up into Thursday's exam, so we'll be doing a review today. My office hours are going to be a little bit, had quite a few people show up yesterday. Wednesday, they're going to look a little bit different because I have some commitments that I have to fulfill Wednesday morning. So at an office hour, I'll be in my office from 2:30 to 3:30 today. If you have any questions, you can kind of stop by. I'll also be in my office tomorrow from 1 to 3. If you want to stop by and ask questions during that time block. If you want to send me an email, I will try my best to kind of get you a response as quick as possible. It may not be immediate, but I'll kind of keep an eye on that leading up to Thursday's exam, okay? The only other thing I would say, if you look at that syllabus, my office hours don't work. I know that I assign you to a TA based off your last name. For the sake of this week, if you want to attend either TA's office hours, whichever one's worked for you, you could attend either one, right? So they'll still have their office hours as normal. And then those tutoring sessions, which will be tonight from 6 to 8 and tomorrow from 6 to 9 over in Wiley 329, those are still going on like they are every single week. If you have questions over any of the practice exam questions, you could go there, they could help you as well. So those are all the resources available to you the next couple of days as you're kind of preparing for that exam on Thursday. Other than that, the only other thing I wanted to mention was if you have an accommodation, I emailed you. If you haven't emailed me back verifying what I sent you in that email, please do so as soon as possible, okay? I'll also mention, just so I don't have to do it during the exam, there are no CL sessions this Thursday or next Monday because we don't have any new material, right? Now, there will be a Module 10 reading pop up because that's assigned before we cover Module 10 next week. So that'll be due at the end of the day next Monday. So after the exam, kind of just like most weeks, there's a module reading that'll be assigned after the exam and due that following Monday. Other than that, any logistical questions about the exam or anything before we dive into material and kind of reviewing for it? I know I went through that kind of quick, but I'm just trying to save us some time to work through questions, okay? Okay, so basically, if you guys have any questions, I can kind of start with those. I've got some in mind that hopefully I think we'll get through if we start to run out of time and no one's asked them. But otherwise, we'll kind of start. Yep, and anything's fair game. I would say probably try to focus a little more on the practice exams, but all these quizzes are good to review if you have additional time. So you said question what? Five? Yeah, so there's one like this on the practice exam, so this will be a good one to work through. So I'm given a certain quantity. I'm told the average total cost. I'm told the marginal cost. In fact, I could make this a little bit more difficult, right? So I'm actually going to switch, if you don't mind, to practice exam A, because this is probably going to be, and I wrote the exam, so I'm saying this, you'd probably see a question that looks more like this. Okay, so similar sort of idea. I'm telling you there's a specific quantity. I give you the marginal, the average total, but here I'm also giving you the average variable costs. Okay, so when I'm thinking about a firm's cost structure, these word problems seem like a lot, right? So there's kind of two things that we want to be able to get out of these word problems. So the first is this idea. So if I'm looking at a firm's cost structure, anytime the marginal cost is above an average, so if this is the average total cost or it's above the average variable cost, well, if I'm adding something that's above the old average, my new average has to be what? Higher. And if it's less than the old average, my new average would be lower. Okay. So if we wanted to put a visualization of this, I have the numbers. I think I was told the marginal cost was 30. The average variable cost was 25. So I know my new average variable cost should be higher or greater than the old value. Now, I was also told my marginal cost is 30 and my average total cost is 35. So I know my new average total cost should be lower or less than 35. Okay. And that's the idea that if I have an average, if my current grade in the class is a 60, if I get an 80 on the exam, what's going to be true about my new grade? It's going to be higher. That's all this is saying. When the marginal cost, the cost I'm adding, is above the old average, my new average has to be higher. If it's below the old average, it has to be lower. So a nice visual that can help you remember this is our average total cost curve always has this U shape to it. Right? Now, if I'm in the short run, my average variable cost also has this U shape to it. And this is where I can get at some additional concepts other than what this question is asking. We'll eventually answer the question, but I think this is good things to remember for other types of questions you could see. What is my average total cost? My average total cost is my, and this is on the formula sheet, my average variable plus my average fixed. Okay. What is any average? It's that total. So my average fixed cost is my total fixed cost divided by quantity. Well, my fixed costs don't change with how much I'm producing, like $1 million. As I produce more, I'm spreading that fixed cost out over more units. So what's always happening by increasing the production level to my average fixed cost? It's going down. Well, the average fixed cost is the difference between my average total and average variable. So that difference is getting smaller and smaller. Right? In fact, when I'm drawing this out, average total cost should always be greater than my average variable costs, with one exception. What do I know I'm in here? The long or the short run? Short run. Why? Because there is a difference between my average total and average variable. In the long run, what is my average fixed cost? 0, so they'd be the same thing. Now, the other concept we can think about is I've got my marginal costs. So with that idea about if I'm adding a cost that's above an average, the new average is higher, my marginal cost is going to hit both of these averages at their minimum point. Okay. So past this point, if my marginal cost is above the average, my new average has to be increasing, right? If marginal costs are ever below an average, my new average is decreasing. So the problem here was told us that at a quantity of 50, right, we had, I'll write it up here, marginal costs were 30, average total costs were 35, and my average variable costs were 25. So I know the point that I'm at, my marginal costs of 30 are below the average variable costs, or sorry, below the average total cost of 35, and that they're above the average variable of 25. So if I instead go from the 50 to the 51st unit, what must be happening to my average total cost? Well, if the amount I'm adding is less than the old average, my new average is, where did I have it? Oh, now I don't know where it's at. Here it is. Less than 35, right? It's decreasing, okay? So I know that my new average total cost is decreasing or must be less than whatever it was before. However, if marginal cost is above the average variable, my new average variable is increasing or must be greater than whatever it was before. Right? So we know those two things are going to be true. Now, also, if I'm producing more, what's always happening to my marginal costs over here? They're increasing. Well, here I need to be a little bit careful because when we're looking over here, if my marginal costs are increasing, my workers my workers are becoming less efficient, or I must be having diminishing returns. If my marginal costs were decreasing, that portion of my marginal cost curve, I have gains from specialization. So I think in this problem, I told you specifically, we're on that diminishing returns portion. So we're thinking about which of these must be correct. We said the average variable cost, yes, it's going up, but we don't know that it's going to be greater than the marginal cost. In fact, we actually know it won't be greater than 30 here, right? We only know that it's going to be greater than the old average variable cost of 25. So this one's not right. If it said the average variable cost is greater than 25, that would be correct. The average total cost is less than 35. Well, we said average total cost, because the marginal cost below it should be decreasing. We know that one's going to be correct. We said average variable is greater than 25, so this one clearly isn't right. Average total cost is less than 30. Well, we know it's going to be lower, but we only know that it's going to be lower than the old average. The old average total cost is 35, so we can't say it's going to be less than 30. We can only say it's going to be less than 35. So that one's not right. And then marginal cost, because we were told we had diminishing returns, we know marginal cost must be going up. So that one's not going to be correct either. Questions on that? So, you can remember this idea of marginal and averages, kind of that relationship and what's happening to your new average. A more like complete thing would be to kind of draw out the entire cost curve. You don't necessarily need to do this, but I think it helps. Okay. Any other questions on this before we keep moving here? And I added some things in here to kind of hit some other concepts that might be good to know. Okay. Any other questions people want to see work through? Yeah. So practice exam B, we're looking at 25. Yeah, so I'll work through 25. I'm going to change it a little bit. This is where practice exam B. Sometimes the question I ask you here might be a little bit more difficult than when I ask you on the exam. But if you can answer a question on practice exam B, you should feel very comfortable kind of going into the exam. So this is a good example of that. So I give you kind of what the quantity was purchased before and after a price change. So essentially, you know the total effect, right? But we want to break this down into the substitution and income effect, okay? So here I've got two goods. I've got ramen and I've got steak. Here I know this is an inferior, I was told this was an inferior good, and I was told steak was a normal good. I then had, I think the price of ramen goes down, right? And I want to break this down into my substitution and my income effect, okay? And I was told the total effect here was that they went from buying what? 10 packets of ramen to 12. So I know the quantity of ramen went up. And, oh no, sorry, this wasn't steak. This was caviar. And we went from 5 to 4. So I know that this quantity was going down. So I told you the total effects here. I'll show you an example where you could figure out what those are. So from the substitution effect, it is simply I buy more of whatever is relatively cheaper, less of whatever is relatively more expensive. So what happens from the substitution effect to these two goods? If ramen is cheaper, I'm going to buy more of it or increase the amount I'm buying. For the other good, it is now relatively more expensive, right? So it didn't have a price change, but we're thinking about the relative prices, right? So when the price of ramen goes down, the relative price of caviar went up, so I'm going to buy less of it. The substitution effect is simply I buy more of whatever has a lower price, less of whatever has a relatively higher price. Any questions on this before I keep moving? So what about the income effect? Well, this is where maybe it helps not to think about just one good, but if I have the same amount of money and the prices of everything goes down, what can I do with that same amount of money? I can buy more. So my real income, when prices go down, is going to go up. When prices are lower, it's almost like I had an income increase. So for a normal good, when I have more money, I'm going to buy more or less of it. If I have more money and it's a normal good, I buy more of it. If it's an inferior good, if I have more money, I actually buy less of it. So on the exam, if I didn't give you what these total effects are, but I asked you, this might be more likely what I would expect of you, what is the total effect for these two goods? Well, without any additional information, what's going to be the total effect? If these are happening at the same time, the amount of ramen I buy is going to be indeterminate. I don't know. Income and substitution effect are working against each other. What about for caviar? I don't know. Right? So the answer for the total effect can be indeterminate. Now here, I told you what the total effects were, which if the total effect for ramen is I buy more, which of these must have been larger? So here, if I identify these effects and I know the total, I always know which of these is going to be larger. And then same kind of idea here. If I know the total effect is I buy less caviar, it must have been that the substitution for it was actually larger as well. Okay. And just to kind of make this point, I could ask you about any combination. I could have two inferior goods, two normal goods, one inferior, one normal, a change in the price of the inferior good, a change in the price of the normal good. I would know how to go through and solve a question like this. Okay. So for example, what if I told you instead the price of caviar goes down? Okay. Well, there, I could break this down into the substitution and the income effect. So what would the substitution effect be here? If caviar is cheaper, I'm going to want to buy more of it. Ramen is now relatively more expensive. I buy less. For the income effect, when prices go down, we said real income goes up, which means for a normal good, I'm going to buy more of it. For an inferior good, I'm going to buy less. Here's a unique situation where I actually know, sorry, this is an R, right? I'm going to buy less ramen, more caviar. So depending on what types of goods we're looking at, depending on what direction and what good has the price change, we could have both changes are indeterminate for the total effect. Both changes are that they, I know with certainty what's going to happen. Now, we also looked through situations before, we worked through problems in, prior to spring break, where sometimes only one of them is indeterminate, right? you can't, I mean, you can memorize this, but right, you'd have what? 1, 2, 3, 4 combinations of inferior normal goods, price increases or decreases in either good. You know, you can memorize all that to be what the total effects are. I guess good on you. I think the easier way to do this is break this down, what this price change did in terms of the substitution, what it did in terms of the income, and then kind of think about if these arrows are in opposite directions. I don't know what happens to quantity. If they're working in the same direction, I can say for sure what the total effect is. Okay. And I might have a question like the one in the exam where I ask you specifically about the substitution or income effect. Okay. Any questions on that type of a problem? So in terms of what I expect you to know, I won't ask you to kind of give me the terminology of if it's a Giffen good. What a Giffen good would be is if the price of something goes down, usually you would think I buy more of it, right? But if I actually buy less of it, what would have to be true here? The income effect would be larger, right? That would make it a Giffen good. I won't ask you to identify it's a Giffen good. I'll simply ask you what the total effect is and what the substitution and income effect are. So if both of these were inferior, what would happen? My real income goes up, I would buy less of both. Yep. So it's still the same kind of concept thought process. We would just have different combinations of what direction those quantities could change. Yeah, so any other questions on this one before we keep moving? Okay. So practice exam A, look at 11 and 12. Kind of slightly different questions here, but these would be good ones to kind of review. All right, there we go. Hopefully that does it. So on 11 here, what type of externality do I have? So what does supply represent? Private. We don't know this. This is a problem. Supply represents marginal costs. Demand represents marginal benefits. So if my private marginal benefits or the demand curve are less than the social benefits, I must have a positive externality. So we have a positive externality here, which we know then that the market is not going to achieve is not going to arrive at the quantity that maximizes total surplus for society. So we'll think about here what is what producer surplus and how could I solve this positive externality issue. Right? So if I'm thinking about a positive externality, so I've got my supply curve representing private marginal costs. That's not true. This is my demand curve representing private marginal benefits, and my supply curve representing private marginal costs. Here's where the market gets to, okay? We had a positive externality, so my marginal social benefits are up here, okay? So the first thing we're thinking about, well, I'll kind of do this in reverse order. Let's think about just producer surplus, okay? No, I guess we have to think about the way I phrase this. We'll think about the first part. So without any negative externalities, the private marginal cost will be the same as the social costs. So where would society want this to be? Wherever the marginal social benefit is equal to the marginal social cost. So what is the market actually doing? The market is underproducing. How can I get the market to produce a higher quantity? I could give subsidies. It's the only tool we have to solve the positive externality issue. Okay. So what would the perfect value of the subsidy be? Well, my marginal social benefits are equal to the private marginal benefits or the demand curve plus whatever that value or external benefit is from that positive externality. So the ideal subsidy would be equal to that external benefit. Now my demand curve plus the subsidy exactly matches up with society's marginal social benefits, and the market gets to that higher quantity. Okay, so that's the first part. Now, without the positive externality, what is producer surplus? So any type of surplus we're talking about, total surplus is the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal costs. Consumer surplus, the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal costs. Producer, same thing, suffers a slight difference. If I'm thinking about just the market overall, what represents marginal benefits? The demand curve. What represents marginal costs? My supply curve. For consumers, what represents marginal benefits? The demand curve. What is the consumer's marginal cost? The price they're paying. For producers, their marginal cost is the supply curve. What is their marginal benefit? When I sell something, the benefit to me is the price, right? So it all starts out from the very same concept. It just looks different if we're looking at producers versus consumers. So at the old equilibrium price, the difference between my supply curve and price, producer surplus would be here. If we use a subsidy and we push this market to a higher quantity, what is my new, what looks like price? Well, it's higher. So with a subsidy, what's going to end up happening, and you can kind of memorize this rule, if I give people money to do something, so let's say I give it to consumers, what's going to happen? Their surplus is going to go fairly intuitive. If I give you money, is your surplus going to go up or down? Up. So consumer surplus would go up. But what happens is no matter who we give the subsidy to, actually both people are going to benefit. So with a subsidy, we said this higher price, well, if the price is higher than it was before, who is that going to be a good thing for? If I'm buying something, is a higher price good? No. When is it good? If I'm selling something. So the price that the sellers receive is now going to be higher. So you could think about like they're receiving $500, but how much did I actually pay as the consumer? Well, if I was given a $200 subsidy, when I paid $500, but the government gave me $200, it's almost like I only paid $300, right? So the price that the consumer pays will go down. That's a good thing for them. The price the seller keeps will go up. That's a good thing for them. Producer and consumer surplus will go up. So we know producer surplus is going to go up is the answer, but why? Well, because now at this higher quantity, what's the difference between my supply curve and the new price that sellers keep? Producer surplus is all of this. So producer surplus with a subsidy will go up. We could draw a similar graph for consumers, and we'll see consumer surplus also goes up. Any questions on this idea?
Triangle, here is the MSC.
Yeah, so I probably wouldn't ask you a question like this. This is kind of tricky. If I use a subsidy, what is deadweight loss to society? If I get to the efficient point for society, deadweight loss is actually 0. If the market stayed where it did, what would be the deadweight loss to society? Well, if the market stays down here, what am I missing out on? Every unit in this range, the marginal social cost is below the marginal social benefit. So if I don't use the subsidy, here would be kind of my deadweight loss to society. But because I use the subsidy, I get to the efficient quantity. Now my deadweight loss is 0. I would probably ask you, it's a little bit, we're kind of combining two things there, but you should expect to know if the market stays where it is, what would the deadweight loss be to society? A little bit different with taxes, right? So let's think about taxes, okay? This is a good question. I was hoping to go through this. So if I have my supply and demand curve, here's where the market's at, right? Now, we just talked about an example where what was the only solution to a subsidy? What was the only solution to a positive externality? The use of a subsidy. Let's say we had a negative externality. So for the sake of the questions I would ask you in this exam, talk to people in other sections, you look online, you can model it different, make it easier. Types of questions I'll ask you. Positive externality is an additional benefit, so we modeled that through the demand curve. Negative externality is an additional cost, so I'm always going to model that through the supply curve. So my marginal social cost will be whatever the private marginal costs were, plus whatever that external cost or value of the negative externality is. So my marginal social cost will always be higher than that supply curve. So where does society want the equilibrium to be? Well, if there's no positive externalities, private marginal benefits are the same as the social benefits. So where does marginal social benefit equal marginal social cost? Oh yeah, if there's a negative externality to something like pollution, society actually wants less of it. So instead of underproducing, the market is actually overproducing. So how do we limit or how do we decrease the quantity? We actually have tons of tools. The easiest one to think about is, how would I shift my supply curve to perfectly match up with society's costs? I could add a tax, right? With this tax, I can get to that efficient point for society. So my deadweight loss, if I use the tax, would be, if I'm at the efficient point for society, deadweight loss is 0. Now, if I didn't use the tax, where does my deadweight loss come from to society? Well, if the market is out here, every additional unit in this range, what is true about the marginal social cost relative to the marginal social benefit? The costs are, got to be able to make this comparison. My costs are greater. So if total surplus, and here we could think about to society, it's always the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost. We're now just focusing on society's marginal benefits and costs. So every unit in this range, if the market produces these units, I'm really producing units that have negative total surplus, or this would be my deadweight loss. Okay. How do I eliminate that? I use a tax. Okay. Now, if I want there to be a lower quantity, and sorry, just to make this point as well before I move on, if a tax increases, if a positive externality or a subsidy kind of increases consumer, I'm mixing up these, hold on, let me restart. If a subsidy increases producer and consumer surplus, what do you think a tax is going to do to producer and consumer surplus? Decrease both, okay? So I wanted to kind of make that comparison. The next thing I want to do is, okay, we can use a tax to solve the negative externality issue, but what can we also do? Well, if I've got my supply and demand curve here, here's where the market would arrive at an equilibrium. If I have a negative externality, what's another way I could push the quantity to be lower? I could use a quota. That's an easy one because it simply says you can't go past this quantity in the market. That's an easy one. What if instead I set a price control up here? Well, what would this, if it's an effective price control, what would this have to be to change the quantity in the market? Yeah, it would have to be a price floor. It doesn't let the price get down to what the old equilibrium price is. Now, for every unit past this point, the people that are buying it, their marginal benefit is lower than the price. They're not willing to buy it anymore. So a price floor can also limit quantity. I could also use a price ceiling, in which case now no producer past this point is willing to supply these. So with a negative externality, we can actually solve this with tax, a price ceiling, a price floor, or a quota. We've got tons of tools. The only thing that fixed our positive externality issue was the use of a subsidy. Okay. I'm putting a lot out there here. We're kind of hitting a lot of different concepts, but I want to hit as much as possible as we're kind of going into this exam. So any questions on this before we keep moving? Any other problems people want to see worked through here? Yeah, so yeah, we actually kind of hit these, right? So if I have a negative externality and I'm comparing the market quantity to the socially efficient quantity, the market quantity is going to be what? 2 relative to where society wants it. The market quantity is 2 high or greater than, right? Now, what could we use to solve the negative externality issue? How do I push the quantity to be lower? I could use a tax. I could use a price ceiling. I could use a price floor. Any other questions people want to see?
We're at 14 or 15 on asset.
Yeah. So I've got a word problem here. We're now starting to think about consumer optimum. So I'm given some information. My income is this amount. I've got what? Taylor Swift tickets, and I've got football tickets, right? And I'm told the prices, okay? So the first question is asking about what's the slope of my budget constraint and if I'm only purchasing one type of good, how much can I buy? So I think I told you in the problem, football tickets are on the x-axis, right? And that Taylor Swift tickets are up here on my y-axis. So I could do this 2 different ways, right? If I'm only buying football tickets, how many can I afford to buy? My income over the price of that good. So here this would be what? 2250 over 250 or 9, right? If I'm only buying Taylor Swift tickets, my income over the price of those tickets. So there I would be where? At a quantity of 3. If I find the quantities, how would I calculate my slope? Well, how do I calculate slope? It's just the change in Y, which is quantity of tickets, over the change in, Taylor Swift tickets, over the change in X. So here I would be going from 3 to 0, 0 to 9. I get what? Negative 1/3. Now, if I didn't give you income, how could you still tell me the slope of this curve? So maybe this is something that I would do on the exam, right? If I didn't give you income, how do I find the slope of my budget constraint? Yeah, if I think about the general version, if I calculate the slope without the numbers, I then rearrange it algebraically. We said it's always going to be the relative price of X. Technically, it's negative. It's downward sloping. The relative price of the X good to the price of the Y good. So in this case, that would be the price of a football ticket over a Taylor Swift ticket, which sure enough gives me that exact same value of 1/3. Okay. So, yep.
You have like 1/3 of what's negative.
I won't do that, right? So you'll notice on the practice exams, I don't have it pulled up right now, but all of them have a negative sign in front of them, right? I'm more focused that you can find the value. So I won't try to trick you with negative signs. Technically, it's always negative, right? Because I've got a downward sloping curve. Yep. So any questions on this before I keep moving? So I think in that one, right, slope was negative 1/3. We're only buying football tickets. Nope. I asked about only Taylor Swift tickets. We can buy 3. But I could have asked you about football tickets, right? And I could have not given you income and still asked you to find the slope of that curve. I could do that. Probably will do that. Okay. So the next question is, what happens to our marginal rate of substitution and the slope of our budget constraint if the price of one of these goods changes? So let's think about initially, if I'm spending optimally, I've gotten to the highest indifference curve possible given my budget constraint. So this is kind of counterintuitive. Notice when we're using quantities, it's like the same as you would always find a slope y over x. But because prices aren't on our y and x axis, the slope when we're looking at prices became the relative price of x over the price of y. A similar sort of concept exists when we're finding the marginal rate of substitution, which is just the slope of our utility or our indifference curve. So this is going to be the margin utility of our X good over the margin utility of our Y good. Okay. So whatever the slope of our budget constraint is, if we're spending optimally, that's also the slope of our indifference curve or our marginal rate of substitution. So what happens if the price of Taylor Swift tickets goes up? Well, if I'm only buying football tickets, how many can I afford to buy? The exact same amount. If I'm buying Taylor Swift tickets, I can now afford to buy fewer, right? So what happened to the slope of my budget constraint? It became steeper or flatter, which means it's getting closer to 0. Well, if the slope of my budget constraint is the same as the slope of this new indifference curve I'm on, my marginal rate of substitution as this curve becomes flatter is going down. Okay. So that was kind of that second question. All right. It's flatter, and my marginal rate of substitution, because if I'm spending optimally, has the same slope. That marginal rate of substitution must be getting closer to 0. Okay. Questions on that before we keep moving? So I could do a similar thing. I could give you a change in the price of either good, X or Y axis, and I could do a price increase or decrease. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so kind of a similar idea. What I'm saying here, if these slopes are the same, what I'm really saying is that the margin utility of X over the margin utility of Y is the same as my relative prices. Okay. If I rearrange this equation a little bit, all this is saying is that the marginal utility per dollar of both goods must be the same if I'm spending optimally. That's the only way those slopes are the same. Okay. So if I'm thinking about an example, doesn't matter in question 16, I'm telling you the marginal utility of, excuse me, apples and oranges. And so here we'll just kind of make, oranges are on the x-axis. So I'll do the margin utility of oranges over the margin utility of apples must be the same as the price of oranges over the price of apples. I told you the margin utility of the last orange was 25. Margin utility of the last apple is 100. So I know my relative prices must be equal to 0.25. Okay. So what's going to happen? Okay, so the first part is, what must be true about the prices of these two goods? Well, if this fraction is equal to 0.25, what must be true about that numerator relative to the denominator? It must be lower, right? That's the only way I get a fraction that's less than 1. The denominator has to be larger. Questions on this idea? Okay. And I think the way it was phrased, the price of oranges is less than the price of apples. Okay. And then the second part is, what must the marginal rate of substitution be equal to? Well, if I know the marginal utilities, my marginal rate of substitution is just those relative marginal utilities. Okay.
For question 19, it's like.
So before I keep moving, any questions on this, and we'll move to the next question. Okay, so 19, go ahead.
Yeah, you don't give like which one's on the x-axis. So how would you know, like, I guess, which was lower versus?
Won't actually matter, right? So if I'm thinking about a 19, I'm told I'm buying lottery tickets and cigarettes, what would put me on a lower indifference curve? So on this one, you could work through, doesn't matter which way I put this. So let's do lottery tickets, cigarettes, right? So think about the first one. First one's probably kind of easy, right? If I have an increase in income, what's going to happen? So if I'm currently here, if I have an increase in income, what's that going to do to my budget constraint? Shift it out. Doesn't matter which of these goods I put in which axis, it's still going to shift it out. I can get to a higher indifference curve. Okay. Any questions on that idea? So on that one, if I have an increase in income, it's going to put me on a higher indifference curve. I'm looking for something that puts me on a lower indifference curve. Okay. So I'll draw this out for either. So let's do lottery tickets, cigarettes, and I'll actually show you, it doesn't matter which way you model this. Okay, since that was the question you asked. So let's say I'm currently here. Doesn't matter which way I model this. Okay? So if I have a decrease in the price of lottery tickets, if I'm only buying lottery tickets, I can now afford to buy more or less. The price goes down, I have the same income, I can buy more, right? So what's going to happen? I'm going to end up on a higher indifference curve. If I did it here, and sorry, I didn't mention this, but if I'm only buying cigarettes, the price of lottery tickets changes. How many cigarettes can I buy? The exact same amount. Same thing down here. If the price of lottery tickets, in this example, we were looking at when it goes down, if I'm only buying lottery tickets, I can now afford to buy more. What ends up happening, I'm on a higher indifference curve. So it doesn't matter which could I put on the X or Y axis, it's still going to show me I'm on a higher indifference curve.
We talked about a different curve for the first topic class, and already showed an example with like a bunch of different curves, say, well, like line. Do you remember like what the point you were making, like, what that was?
So this is kind of leading us to what we're using here. At every point, what am I looking at? The consumer optimum is where I've gotten to the highest possible indifference curve given my budget constraint. So when I showed you multiple indifference curves, all I was doing was saying, if I have a budget constraint, if I'm on this indifference curve, there's 2 points on it, but are those optimal? No, because if I change my spending habits, I can get to a higher indifference curve, right? So we're not really, we don't really worry about these other indifference curves. We just worry about what's the highest indifference curve we can get to given our budget constraint. Okay? And then we would work through the rest of these examples. But instead of drawing out every single one, we saw here that a price decrease did what? Put us on a higher indifference curve, right? So intuitively, this makes sense. If prices are lower, can I afford more or less utility than before? More. So what's the only thing that's going to put me on a lower indifference curve or a lower level of total utility? If the price of one of the goods goes up, right? So the option there that put me on a lower indifference curve was what? Prices of cigarettes went up. Okay. So you can draw it out here, or that kind of intuition there is really kind of lines up with what we're drawing. Okay.
So income so moves over the whole budget boost. Constraint.
Not quite. There's actually 2 things that could shift this out, right? Since you're asking the question, we'll kind of move here quickly after this. But like, let's say I had lottery tickets and I had cigarettes here. What's the slope of my budget constraint? Price of the X good over the price of the Y good. So what could cause my budget constraint to shift out parallel? If I had a change in the price of both goods, that was like the same proportional change, right? Then it would look just like an income increase. But in terms of like answering this question, in fact, one of the answers was if I had a decrease in the price of both goods. So what would that look like? An increase in income, which puts me on a higher indifference curve. Any other questions people want to see worked through here? Yeah. Not for this question, right? Not if we just want to know what gets me to a higher indifference curve. It does matter in the question that we worked through earlier, which is income substitution and total effects. Any other questions we want to see worked through? All right, ready to take the exam Thursday? No other questions in class? Yeah. Yeah. You guys showed up. I mean, I'm being a bit facetious, but right, you showed up. So I want to make sure we work through all these, now's the time to ask questions. Okay. So 17, we're looking at two goods. And we kind of talked about this concept earlier, where that margin utility per dollar we're spending should be the same, right? So in this example, we've got pizza and we've got video games, right? So what should be true is that the margin utility per dollar I'm spending on both goods should be the same, okay? I was told that the margin utility of the last pizza was 10, nope, what was it? 15, the price was 10. Margin utility of the last video game was 50, price was 40. If I do this calculation, I actually end up saying, oh, these are in fact not equal. The marginal utility per dollar of pizza is actually higher. So what do I want to do in terms of how much I'm buying of both of these goods? Well, I want the most additional utility per dollar I'm spending, or whatever good has a higher margin utility per dollar, I want to buy more of that. So if I'm spending all of my income, if I buy more pizza, inherently I'm going to have to buy fewer video games. Okay. Now, what's going to happen when I do that? So if I think about this case, where this is the scenario we found, right? The margin utility per dollar was higher, for pizza. As I buy more pizza, what happens to the margin utility of the last pizza I bought? So as I buy more of something, the margin utility is going down, in which case this would go down. If I buy less of something, what's happening to the margin utility of a video game? The last one I bought, it's going up. Well, that's going to happen until these are again equal to each other, right? So I think the first part of the question was, what should I buy more of, right? Or no, it was, should I buy more or less video games? Fewer video games. And then as a result, if I buy fewer video games, what's happening to the margin utility of the last one I bought? It must be going up. And then I could have asked you the same thing about pizza here as well, right? So you could have answered either one of those questions. Any questions on this problem? Yeah, I said here. Any other questions people want to see worked through? Or even a type of question I can try to come up with one off the top of my head. Yeah. Exam A. Yeah, so if I'm looking here, I gave you the quantity of labor and the number of units they were producing. So if I wanted to find the marginal product of labor, how would I do that? So the marginal anything, so if I want to know how much are these workers producing, it's how much output is increasing by, divided by a change in the quantity. But if I'm looking at labor, a change in the quantity of labor is a change in the number of workers, right? So I wanted to go through this, maybe instead of switching off the screen here. Oops. So if I go from a quantity of 0 to 10, how much did my production change by? It went from 0 to, so 100 divided by how many more workers did I hire? So 100 over 10 would be, here, how much did output go up by if I went from 10 to 20 workers? 120 divided by 10. And then I kind of keep going through this. So this is what, 150 divided by 10. This was 100 divided by 10. This was 50 divided by 10, right? So if I'm looking at that 30th worker, what must be true, right? Well, going from 20 to 30 workers, what happened to my marginal product of labor? It went up. So my workers were becoming more effective. So I must have had gains from specialization. If my workers are becoming more effective, I'm getting more units for every worker I hire. So the per unit costs are actually going to be lower, right? I paid, paid whatever a worker costs, but I'm now getting more units per worker. So my cost per unit must be going down. So I've got gains from specialization. And because of that, my marginal costs are decreasing. I think we had it, the very first question we worked through. When marginal costs were decreasing, I said we must have had gains from specialization. Now, if I look at going from 30 to 40 or 40 to 50 workers, my marginal product is going down. My workers are becoming less effective. I must have diminishing returns. And that means my marginal costs are then going up. Okay. So this is kind of this connection between the marginal product of labor and my marginal costs. Okay. Any questions on this one before we keep moving? Any other questions people want to see worked through here?
You do one where it's like you have two products and then you have an option. Go back. See which one.
So what be a little more specific.
I think it was like either the first, yeah, how many you buy of each based off your margin.
Oh. So, I mean, let's see, is there one on practice exam B like that? I don't think I gave you anything like that because I probably was just using that to set things up. But I think what you're asking about is something like, something like this, right? Sorry, it was taking me. I understand what you're asking now. So what I would want to do here to figure out how much I buy, well, the other thing I would need to know is how much income do I have? So I think this will hopefully help us out. So what I would want to do here is I always want to buy whatever has the highest marginal utility per dollar. So I essentially need to add in these additional columns. So what's the margin utility per dollar of that first unit of X? 20 over 2.5. So that would be what? 8, if I'm doing math in my head correct. 15 over 2.5 would give me 6. 10 over 4, 2. Here, if I divide the margin utility of Y by the price, I get 4, 3, 2, and 1. So now I have to go through this thought process. What do I buy first? Well, what has the highest margin utility per dollar? That first unit of X. I've now spent what? $2.50. What do I buy next? The first unit of Y or the second unit of X? Well, 4 is less than 6, so I buy that second unit here. Do I buy the third unit of X or the first unit of Y? Well, here I'm actually indifferent, right? So usually if we're indifferent, a fail-safe is I choose whichever one is less expensive, right? It saves me more money. So I'll buy the first unit of good Y. Now do I buy the third unit of X or the second unit of Y? Third unit of X. So I'm at what? 7, so I'm at 9.5 here. Do I buy the fourth unit of X or the second unit of Y? Second unit of Y. Do I buy the fourth unit of X or the third unit of Y? Well, I'm indifferent once again. So I add what? 2, 13.5 here. Now, can I afford to buy either good? No, I kind of chose these numbers. I probably would have chose something to work out a little bit nice and easier. So the last unit you decide, you've got exactly how much. So in this example, I end up buying 3 of both. That's not necessarily the case. Let's say I only had $9.50. Well, that's where I would have bought what? 3 and actually 1, right? So I could give you any income, any prices, and you basically create these margin utility per hour columns and then kind of go back and forth until you spent all of your income. And the tiebreaker is always the cheaper good. Any other questions on this one? No, it doesn't. Nothing on the this is on the practice exams, but it was like an old quiz question and practice problem, so it would be fair game. Yeah. So there could be. So all we're thinking about there is how do we identify what these goods are? So whether or not they're rival or excludable. So in terms of, so I think there's one on one of the exams. Where's this at? Is it A? No, I think it's on B. I said A is probably a little bit more comparable to what we do on the exam. I thought there was one on here. Maybe there's no.
I saw it. It's like
13? Okay, I didn't go back.
it's somewhere.
Oh yeah, there we go. 13, right? So if I've got a public good, so there we said a public good, and this is where it might help to anchor your idea of what it is to an example. So one thing that's a public good we can think about is like a community park. So the idea of a public good is everybody can use it, right? So it would be non-excludable. You don't have to pay to use it. So this word of excludable or non-excludable, excludable just means I have to pay to use it. Non-excludable, I don't have to. Now here I probably would have to throw on an adjective, which is that it's an uncrowded public park. So you going to use it doesn't prevent other people from going and using it as well. That would make it, well, if you using it doesn't prevent someone from using it, it would be non-rival. If it was like a packed park and there's now no other places where you can like put your blanket and have a nice picnic, well, now it is rival, right? There's no more space for you. So those traits allow us to identify what type of good is. You could be asked a question like that. Okay? And then the second part of this one is, oh, if I've got the free rider problem, then they become a what? So the free rider problem was the idea that we see something be overused, or essentially a public good goes from being non-excludable and non-rival to my example, it's still a free public park. It's still non-excludable. You don't have to pay to use it, but now you using it prevents other people from using it. Excuse me. So it's now rival, in which case we would have kind of what? These common resource games. Now I'd probably a little bit more focus on like using a public good or using a common resource example to where we said common resources typically have what? So if it's rival, but it's not excludable, people don't have to pay to use it. This is the idea of like fish. We overfish. We then eliminate fish population. So we cause what type of externality? Negative. So I'd be more likely to phrase the question probably like, if I have a common resource and we have a negative externality, what happens to most common resources? Well, with the negative externality, we can kind of prove and show that they are overused, right? And then with a public good, we tend to see that, okay, it's free, everyone can use it. There's usually positive externalities. Well, there, we get that people aren't using it enough, right? This is the idea of like, let's say we could all, what's a good public good example where we see, yeah, if you have positive externalities, we don't see people use enough. So this would be like even like if let's say higher education was completely free, right? And that there's no capacity on the rooms. You actually still see people don't use it enough because they might not want to go to college, even if it's free, they don't care. They just want to, they like whatever job they're doing. But we know if we could get them better educated, there's positive externalities to society. We see too fewer people actually go pursue higher education, right? But there you're really then back to just looking at negative positive externality models, which once again, I can't reiterate enough. You use ChatGPT or you're looking at other classes. Could make it harder if you wanted to, but the only way that you need to be expected on this exam is model positive externalities through the demand curve because there are additional benefits, model negative externalities through the supply curve, there are additional costs, okay? Doesn't matter if they come from the production or consumption of a good, right? You would still model them the same way, okay?
You talk about how price elasticity affects the that.
Yeah, this is a good question. There is one on, I forget what question it is, but I think I can remember the numbers. So we'll see if I can. So all we're doing to say if I have a tax, who bears more of the burden? That's what you're asking. So whoever is more, I won't ask you about a subsidy, so we'll just kind of focus on this. Maybe I'll mention if we have time. So if I'm more inelastic, that means if I'm being more elastic, I'm not responding to price changes. I'm walking around like an idiot and acting like it didn't happen. So if I act like something didn't happen, this is my idea of like, I'm standing next to somebody and a car is moving at us. If I'm not responsive, who's going to bear the burden of that car coming at them? The person who's unresponsive. So if I'm more unresponsive, I'm inelastic, who's going to bear more of the burden of the tax? The inelastic person. So if I had like an income elasticity of demand and supply that looked like this, well, we always know this will be negative. So when we actually talk about elasticities, we were always just looking at the absolute value, right? So here, our consumers, they have a higher elasticity of demand. So higher elasticities mean someone is more elastic. So who is more inelastic here? Producers. So who's going to bear more of the burden of the tax? Producers, right? Now you can help remember this idea. If it's like, oh, I have a hard time remembering more, sometimes I get it confused. I think more elastic means I bear more of the burden. Think about a scenario where you make consumers perfectly inelastic, right? So what's going to happen is if I had a supply curve, what does a perfectly inelastic demand curve look like? I don't respond at all to price changes. I keep buying the exact same amount. It would be vertical. So without a tax, here's the equilibrium price. Where would producer surplus be? Producer surplus, what's their benefit? The price. What's their cost? The supply curve. So here I've got producer surplus. What is consumer surplus? The area above the price they pay, but below their demand curve. Well, it's kind of weird here because like below the demand curve, it's vertical. So it'd be like this area here. So here was my consumer surplus before the tax. If I have a tax, now my supply curve is somewhere up here. Well, what's this new equilibrium? It's at the same quantity. So what is my deadweight loss? Kind of a tricky one. If I have perfectly inelastic demand, what is deadweight loss? Well, if I'm at the same quantity that's efficient for the market, deadweight loss is 0. So we can think about why. This is my new equilibrium price, but what does a tax do? It should usually hurt both people. So what would hurt consumers if the price was higher? Now, if consumers are perfectly inelastic, the amount they pay minus the tax, this is the price that sellers keep. Notice for sellers or producers, price stays the same. They don't lose any surplus. Why? Because they responded to the tax. They responded to the price change. Who didn't respond at all? Consumers. So what is their surplus? Now only here, all of the consumer surplus lost becomes tax revenue. So all of tax revenue, who bared the burden of that? Only consumers. So that's like an extreme example where consumers, the entire burden of the tax fell on them because they were perfectly inelastic. Usually we don't have perfect elasticities, so we're just looking at whoever was more inelastic, they're going to bear more of the burden of that tax. Okay. And then I forget now if you asked about it was you asked about subsidy. Well, with a subsidy, we said consumer and producer surplus do what? A good way to remember this is taxes are if the government taxes you, is that a good or a bad thing? Bad. So it's going to hurt you or reduce both consumer and producer surplus. Subsidies are a good thing. They give you an additional benefit. That's going to increase producer and consumer surplus, right? So there we wouldn't think about who's bearing the burden of the tax. We're thinking about who's actually receiving more of the benefit of the subsidy. But I didn't give you any questions like that. We'll just focus on kind of bearing the burden of a tax as opposed to enjoying the benefit of the subsidy. Yep. Any other questions people have here? No other questions? Any other logistical questions about the exam? Yeah. So there may or may not be. I won't confirm it, but I wrote the exam. It's already printed, so yeah. Okay. So 25 multiple choice exam. Once again, everything will look very similar in terms of the formatting on Thursday as the first exam. I have an exam right before this, so I try to get them out here quickly so that you guys can kind of file in. So try to get here at least 10 minutes early so we can get everybody in, get started right at 9:35. Otherwise, it's office hours, TA office hours, tutoring sessions, all available before Thursday. Good luck studying, and I will see you guys Thursday.